You know, you hear about wars throughout history, grand battles, significant casualties, but have you ever come across one where the most notable injuries were reportedly from a bear?
Yeah, yeah.
That's our deep dive today. The Aroostook War, also known, and this is great, as the Pork and Beans War.
It certainly makes you curious, doesn't it?
It really does. What's that all about?
It does. And what's fascinating here is, this wasn't just some minor local spat. We're talking the 1830s, and tensions between the U.S. and Great Britain were genuinely high.
Really?
Over what? It all came down to a disagreement over the border. Where exactly did Maine end and the British colony of New Brunswick begin?
Ah, a border dispute.
Exactly. And it shows how even just drawing lines on maps can, well, cause major international friction.
Okay, so border disputes happen, but what made this one so contentious? Why did it almost turn into, actual fighting?
Well, the root cause goes way back to the 1783 Treaty of Versailles, the one that ended the American Revolution.
Yeah.
While it covered a lot, the wording defining that northeastern boundary was, let's just say, vague.
Vague how?
It just lacked the precision needed. Didn't clearly spell out where Maine stopped and British North America started.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, there was this ambiguity baked in.
Wow. So unclear wording in a treaty from decades before just lingered. It's a good reminder about details, isn't it? Even in legal documents.
Absolutely.
But what was actually at stake? Why did both sides care so much about this particular piece of land?
Well, a couple of big things. First, the area was packed with valuable timber, really good forests.
Ah, resources.
Yep, both American and British logging operations wanted in. And when Maine became a state in 1820, that competition for lumber, it just intensified.
Makes sense. Competition over resources driving conflict. We see that a lot.
We do. It shows how even seemingly remote land can become a flashpoint when resources are involved.
Was timber the only thing, though? Or was there more to it?
Oh, definitely more. For the British, there was a major strategic angle. They really wanted a secure overland route, the so-called Halifax Road. It was meant to connect Lower Canada, Quebec, basically with their maritime colonies like New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Why was that route so important?
Super important in winter. When the St. Lawrence River froze over, that disrupted shipping. So this road was vital for year-round connection and military movement if needed.
Right. So Americans wanted timber, British wanted strategic access.
Exactly. Competing interests. That really raised the stakes.
I've heard something about logging licenses being suspended to try and cool things down.
Precisely. That was in 1826. An attempt, to pause things while diplomats tried to sort out the border. They stopped issuing new logging licenses in the contested zone.
Did it work?
Not really. If anything, it might have just frustrated people more, the ones already invested there. And it probably fueled more sort of unofficial logging. Didn't really stop it.
So a temporary fix that maybe just complicated things on the ground even more?
Could be argued, yeah.
So for you listening, this really shows how economics and strategy get tangled up, doesn't it? Driving these international tensions over what seems like just a borderline.
Exactly. What looks like an obscure historical squabble was rooted in very real, tangible needs for both countries.
Okay, so who were the people on the ground who first really pushed these simmering tensions into the open?
Well, one name that pops up early is John Baker.
John Baker.
Yeah, an American guy. He settled up in the upper St. John Valley around 1817, became a really outspoken advocate for the American claim to that land. He definitely started testing the waters.
How did he do that? Was he writing letters, lobbying?
More direct than that. Pretty symbolic, actually.
Ah.
On the 4th of July, 1827, he holds this Independence Day party at his place,
Okay.
which was on the north shore of the St. John River land the British claimed. And to top it off, he raises an American flag.
Ooh, okay. Raising the stars and stripes on disputed territory on Independence Day. That's bold.
Definitely a statement. A direct challenge to British authority right where they claimed it.
So how did the New Brunswick folks react to that?
Not well, unsurprisingly. They saw it as provocative, rebellious even.
I bet.
So, late September that same year, they arrest him, an American citizen, openly challenging them on what they saw as British soil.
Arrested him?
Yep. Hauled him off to Fredericton, the capital of New Brunswick, put him on trial, sentenced him to 3 months in jail for, quote, rebellious activities.
Wow, 3 months for raising a flag. That seems serious.
It shows how individual acts like that can suddenly become international incidents, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So how did Maine react? Their citizen gets jailed by the British.
Oh, it lit a fire under them. Public opinion, the state government in Maine, they were outraged. Saw it as an affront, a violation of their citizens' rights.
So Maine got involved.
They had to. The state was still pretty new, and they felt they needed to act. They started pushing the federal government in Washington, D.C. pretty hard. Assert the U.S. claim, protect Americans living there.
So, one guy, one flag, one arrest. And suddenly it's escalating from a local issue to something needing federal attention.
Exactly. A perfect example of how individual actions can snowball politically.
Okay, so that's the American angle through Baker. But what about the people actually living in this disputed zone? The long-term residents, what did they think?
Yeah, the local perspective is crucial and often overlooked. In 1839, the governor of New Brunswick, Sir John Harvey, actually went there and reported back. He talked about the Acadians in Madawaska.
The Acadians, the French-speaking settlers.
That's right. And according to Harvey, they expressed a, quote, unanimous and spontaneous desire to remain under the jurisdiction of New Brunswick.
Really? That's interesting. You might think they'd lean towards the U.S. Why stay with the British?
Well, historical accounts suggest it wasn't really about loyalty to the crown per se. It was more practical. They were afraid.
Afraid of what?
Losing their land. They worried that if the U.S. took over, American landlords might not recognize their existing claims, their traditional ways of holding land, their way of life, basically.
Ah, so it was about security, protecting their homes and farms.
Exactly. A pragmatic choice based on safeguarding what they had more than a political allegiance.
Yeah.
It adds a layer of complexity, right?
Definitely. Were there other groups there, too, with different views?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm.
Also in Madawaska, there was this other French-speaking group known as the Bryons.
Bryons.
Mm-hmm. And they had this interesting identity. They kind of saw themselves as part of this unofficial République du Madawaska.
The Republic of Madawaska.
Yeah. And they didn't feel particularly strong ties to either the U.S. or Britain. They were their own distinct community caught in the middle.
Wow. Caught between two empires, feeling loyal to neither. That complicates things even more.
It does.
And I guess all those seasonal lumberjacks we talked about earlier pouring in didn't help the local situation.
Oh, absolutely not. That influx, mostly transient workers coming in for the winter logging season, just cranked up the tension over timber control. More people, more competition, more chances for disputes right there on the ground. It just inflamed everything.
Sounds like a real powder keg. Competing claims, local anxieties, outside workers, and things escalated beyond just flags and logging disputes, right? Didn't Maine try to run a U.S. census there?
They did. Another key incident showing how things were heating up. This was in 1830. Maine sent officials John Dean and Edward James into the territory.
To count people for the U.S. Census?
Yep, partly. And also to kind of assess what they saw as British encroachment. See who was there, basically.
How did that go over to locals? Were they okay being counted by Maine?
Well, interestingly, some residents on the west bank of the St. John River actually wanted to be part of Maine. They sent petitions.
Really?
Yeah. And following the Maine officials' advice, they even held meetings to pick representatives, hoping to incorporate Madawaska as a town within Maine.
But I'm guessing the New Brunswick side wasn't thrilled about that.
Not at all. A resident loyal to New Brunswick tipped off the local militia.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. The militia showed up at one of these organizing meetings, threatened to arrest anyone trying to form a town under U.S. authority.
Did they stop?
Nope. They kept meeting. So a bigger group of militiamen came back and actually arrested some of the organizers. Others apparently managed to escape into the woods.
Arrests again, just for trying to organize locally.
Yep. And the local Americans quickly sent messages to Augusta, Maine's capital, telling them what happened.
So even something as seemingly normal as a census or trying to set up local government could get you arrested or force you to flee. It really hammers home how contested this place was.
Absolutely. Both sides were digging in their heels, determined to assert control.
Which brings us to the main event, I suppose, the wonderfully named Bloodless Aroostook War. Let's get into that. Was it really bloodless?
Well, the term war here is maybe a bit strong. It's more rhetorical flair than actual description of, army versus army combat.
Okay.
Militia units were mobilized on both sides, absolutely. But thankfully, no actual battles happened between organized U.S. and British forces.
So more of an international incident, with militias involved.
Exactly. Civilian posses, militias, but no formal military engagement. And remarkably, yeah, despite thousands of armed men milling about, nobody was killed in a direct fight.
Okay, so no big battles. But things must have happened, right, during this period. What were both sides actually doing?
Oh, definitely. Things happened. Maine kicked things off in a big way in January 1839. They sent their land agent, Rufus McIntyre, with a posse of volunteer militia into the Aroostook River area.
What for?
Their mission was to arrest New Brunswick lumberjacks operating in the disputed zone and, crucially, confiscate their gear: oxen, horses, equipment.
Whoa. Going in to arrest people and take their stuff, that sounds provocative.
Extremely. A very direct move, bound to get a reaction.
And how did the New Brunswick lumberjacks take that?
They weren't happy, obviously.
Yeah.
When they heard that oxen and horses had been seized, they retaliated.
Oh.
A group of them actually broke into the arsenal in Woodstock to get weapons.
Armed themselves?
Yep. Formed their own posse, and then, under cover of darkness, they went and captured the Maine guys McIntyre and his assistants.
They captured the Maine officials.
They did. Apparently took them off to Woodstock, some say in chains, for an interview. Tit for tat, escalating quickly.
Captured in the night, taken for an interview. This sounds less like war and more like a very intense frontier feud.
It had elements of that, for sure.
So you've got posses arresting each other. How big did the military mobilization get?
It got pretty substantial, actually. Maine authorized raising up to 10,000 militiamen.
10,000.
Yep. And New Brunswick probably had around 15,000 mobilized between their local militia and some British Army regulars nearby.
15,000. That's a lot of troops.
It is. And Maine started building forts to assert their presence: Fort Fairfield, Fort Kent.
Building forts in the disputed area.
Right on it.
Yeah.
And the British responded by moving regular army troops down from Quebec City, positioning them near Fort Kent. So you had armed camps basically facing each other.
Wow. That many armed men that close together. It's amazing no real fighting broke out.
It really is. The
Yeah.
potential was definitely there.
And this is where the bears come in, isn't it? The slightly comical side of this war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where the story takes that weird, famous turn. You have the Battle of Caribou.
The Battle of Caribou. Tell me about that.
Well, the story goes, a black bear, presumably attacked a group of New Brunswick lumberjacks or militiamen.
Okay.
And in the chaos, maybe panic, shots were fired. Accounts differ on who shot first or why, but the end result: the bear was killed.
The bear was killed.
Yep. And that incident has gone down in history, somewhat jokingly, as the only combat fatality of the Aroostook War.
A bear. The only casualty of a war involving maybe 25,000 troops?
It's memorable, isn't it? Really highlights how unique this whole situation was.
You don't get that in most history books. And weren't there other bear incidents too?
Yes, there are other accounts. Reports of at least 2 British militiamen being injured by bears during all this activity in the woods.
Injured by bears.
Apparently so, yeah. So no human deaths from fighting, but the local wildlife definitely made its presence felt.
It's almost absurd. Thousands of soldiers, forts being built, international crisis looming, and the main action involves bears. It really drives home the bloodless part.
It does indeed.
So with all this posturing, fort building, bear encounters, but no actual combat, how did they finally calm things down? How was it de-escalated?
Diplomacy, that was key. President Martin Van Buren saw how dangerous things were getting.
Smart move.
Yeah. He decided to send in a negotiator, Brigadier General Winfield Scott.
Winfield Scott. Big name later in the Mexican-American War and Civil War, right?
Very same. He was sent up to Boston in early March 1839, then headed to the border region to try and broker a truce.
And was he successful? What made him the right guy for the job?
Well, a really interesting factor was his personal history with the governor of New Brunswick, Sir John Harvey.
They knew each other.
They did. From the War of 1812, believe it or not. Scott had actually been Harvey's prisoner of war for a time.
No.
Yeah. And apparently they developed some mutual respect back then. That existing relationship, that bit of trust, likely made a huge difference in opening lines of communication and negotiating a temporary ceasefire.
Wow. A personal connection forged during a previous war helps prevent a new one. That's incredible.
It really shows how personal relationships can sometimes be vital in diffusing these really tense international moments.
So Scott brokers a truce, but that's just temporary, right? How did they get to a permanent fix for the border?
Right. A truce just pauses things. The lasting solution came a few years later with the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842.
Ah, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. I've heard of that. That was a big one for U.S.-Canada, wasn't it?
Huge. It settled not just the Maine-New Brunswick border, but a bunch of other outstanding issues between the U.S. and Great Britain at the time, negotiated by U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Webster and Britain's Lord Ashburton.
Okay, so what did the treaty actually do regarding this border? What were the key terms?
Well, it finally drew the line. It set the St. John and St. Francis rivers as the boundary above Grand Falls.
And who got what?
In the end, the U.S., specifically Maine, got the larger chunk of the disputed territory. about 7,015 square miles. So America got most of what it had been arguing for territorially.
Okay, so a win for Maine, mostly. What did Britain get out of it? They must have gotten something.
They did. They secured that vital overland connection. They wanted the Halifax Road route. That was preserved.
Oh, the strategic route.
Exactly. In terms of land, Britain received about 5,012 square miles. The treaty also guaranteed navigation rights on the St. John River for both sides, free and open.
Okay.
And importantly, it protected existing land grants. So people who had grants from either Britain or Maine wouldn't lose their land just because the border shifted. That offered some security to the locals.
So a compromise. Both sides gave a little. Both sides got key objectives met. Land for the U.S., the road for Britain, protections for locals. Makes sense. And didn't the U.S. government also pay Maine and Massachusetts some money?
Yes, that's right. The federal government paid Maine and Massachusetts $150,000 each.
Why Massachusetts?
Maine had originally been part of Massachusetts, so Massachusetts still had some residual land claims in the area. The money was compensation for the lands they officially gave up and for the expenses they'd run up during the dispute, mobilizing militias and all that.
Okay, seems like a pretty comprehensive deal. Covered the land, the strategy, the locals, the finances. But I remember hearing something weird about the maps used in the negotiation. Something fishy.
Ah, yes. The Battle of the Maps. That's a really fascinating, slightly sneaky part of the story.
Go on.
Well, the story goes, and it's debated a bit, that both Webster and Ashburton might have had maps that actually supported the other side's claims more strongly.
Really? Why would they have those?
The theory is they used these maps strategically to persuade their own governments and constituents to accept the compromise. Like, look, this map suggests the other side could have gotten even more, so this deal we negotiated is actually pretty good for us.
Huh. So they might have bluffed using maps that hurt their own case to make the final deal look better.
That's the allegation. There's a famous story about Webster showing a map, supposedly marked by Benjamin Franklin himself, to folks from Maine and Massachusetts to convince them the U.S. was getting a fair shake. Whether that map was genuine or accurate is, well, another question entirely.
Wow. Politics and map making adds a layer of intrigue, doesn't it?
Definitely some political maneuvering involved, it seems.
So, setting aside the map shenanigans, how do historians view the treaty overall? Was it considered a fair deal?
Opinions have varied over time. Some historians, like William Ganong, actually argued it was more favorable to Britain.
Why?
Ganong looked closely at the original 1783 treaty wording and believed it actually gave Maine a much stronger claim to nearly all the disputed land. So from that perspective, the U.S. gave up too much.
Interesting.
But regardless of who got the slightly better deal on paper, the most important outcome was that it settled the dispute peacefully. It avoided war, finalized the border, and that was crucial for both nations.
Right. Peace was the main win. But what about the people living there, the Acadians who wanted to stay with New Brunswick? How did this new border affect them?
Yeah, that's one of the less positive outcomes, unfortunately. The new border line basically cut right through a culturally unified Acadian population.
Divided their community.
Exactly. Split them between two countries, two legal systems. Created what some call an unnatural boundary that didn't reflect the existing community ties.
That's tough.
It was. But it's also interesting that, over the long run, those Acadian communities in Maine and New Brunswick have largely maintained really close family and social connections across that border. They kind of ignore it for social purposes, even today.
So the community ties endured despite the political line.
To a large extent, yes. Their identity reflects both that shared Acadian heritage and their respective American or Canadian citizenship.
That's a powerful reminder, isn't it? That lines on maps can have real human consequences, even if people find ways to bridge them. So, looking back at the whole Aroostook War saga, the Bloodless War, the bears, the diplomacy, what's its lasting significance? Why should we remember it?
Well, even without combat deaths, it was hugely significant. First, it finally definitively settled that troublesome Maine-New Brunswick border, removed a major source of U.S.-British friction.
Okay, that's big.
Second, it set a really important precedent for peacefully resolving border disputes between the U.S. and what would become Canada. The compromise approach used in Webster-Ashburton influenced how they settled the much longer border further west later on.
So this small conflict in the Maine woods actually helped shape the entire peaceful U.S.-Canada border we have today.
It definitely contributed to that pattern of negotiation rather than conflict. It became a model, in a way.
That's a major takeaway. And it fits into that larger story of U.S.-Canada relations mostly friendly, but with moments of tension, right? Like the whole centenary of peace idea they celebrated around 1913.
Exactly. The Aroostook War is a great case study. It shows how even friendly neighbors can have serious disputes flare up.
Mm.
But it also shows that diplomacy, communication, understanding, they can work.
Yeah.
Conflict isn't inevitable.
Yeah.
And it's kind of neat that the railway line route, which was part of that British strategic goal secured in the treaty, is actually still in use today, running through Maine, a tangible link back to the 1840s.
Wow, still there. Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive. The Aroostook War, aka the Pork and Beans War, a really unique piece of history.
Definitely.
A war defined not by battles, but by rising tensions over land and timber, some militia posturing, and, weirdly, bears.
Can't forget the bear.
Never forget the bears. And ultimately resolved not by fighting, but by talking the Webster-Ashburton Treaty.
That sums it up well. What's really striking is how close it came to being much worse.
Yeah.
A local dispute with the potential to blow up into a major conflict between global powers.
Yeah.
It just hammers home how vital clear communication is, understanding different viewpoints, the governments, the locals, the loggers, and the power of negotiation to find a way out, even when things look pretty grim.
And for everyone listening, hopefully this dive into the Aroostook War shows how these quirky, sometimes funny-sounding historical events often have really deep roots in serious issues, economic strategy, international relations.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's also a reminder that peaceful solutions, while maybe not easy, are possible even when tensions are high.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you to ponder. How often do we see disagreements, big or small, escalate because of unclear boundaries, competing interests, maybe a lack of understanding?
Good question.
What lessons can we take from the Aroostook War's peaceful, is slightly bizarre resolution for handling those situations today? Thinking about the human side of disputes, the impact of diplomacy, maybe there's something useful there.
It's definitely some food for thought. If this deep dive has piqued your interest, maybe check out the Webster-Ashburton Treaty itself, or look into the history of those Acadian communities living along the border today. It's a fascinating legacy.
Agreed.
Thanks for joining us on this surprisingly bear-filled historical journey.